Steve Jobs once said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." But behind that simple phrase was a darker truth. A truth born out of pain, rejection, and the crushing weight of failure. This isn't the story of Apple, or the iPhone, or Pixar. This is the story of a man who discovered that the most dangerous prison in the world was the need for approval. And the only way to escape was to destroy it. Today, you and I will step into the shadows of Steve Jobs' mind to learn why he changed himself for himself. Most of us live our lives chained to one invisible master. It is not money. It is not power. It is not even a success. It is the constant, gnawing hunger for approval. Think about it. From the moment you were a child, you were trained to seek it. You wanted your parents to clap when you did something right. You wanted your teachers to validate your intelligence. You wanted your friends to see you as cool. And as you grew older, that approval didn't vanish. It just evolved. You started dressing for it, speaking for it, posting for it, and working for it. But here is the dark truth Steve Jobs discovered early in his life: approval is a prison. And the more you chase it, the tighter the walls close in around you. When Jobs was young, he was desperate for people to see him as different. He wanted to be respected for his brilliance, admired for his vision, and recognized for his defiance against conformity. But instead, he was doubted. His colleagues thought he was arrogant. Investors thought he was unstable. Competitors thought he was a joke. And critics, they didn't just disagree with him, they dismissed him completely. For years, Steve carried the weight of other people's opinions on his back. Every innovation, every presentation, every bold idea was secretly fueled by an unspoken desire. Maybe now, they'll finally see me. But the more he chased that recognition, the emptier he felt. Because the truth is, the crowd never gives you enough. You may receive applause today, but tomorrow they will forget. You may be admired in one season, but in the next you are torn down. Approval is not a foundation. It is quicksand. Then came the breaking point. The world knows the story. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, was fired from his own company. Humiliated, abandoned, rejected by the very people he built with. Imagine that for a moment. The company you birthed, the vision you fought for, the empire you helped shape, taken away. And you are cast aside like you never mattered. In that moment, Jobs faced a choice. He could continue living for the approval of others, desperately trying to win back their respect. Or he could confront the reality that had been staring at him all along. No amount of applause could ever define him. And so, in the silence of his downfall, Jobs saw the illusion for what it was. Approval was not power. Approval was a leash, and the day he let it go, he became free. What does this mean for you? It means if you are still measuring your worth through the eyes of others, you are already defeated. You may think you are chasing success, but you are really chasing validation. You may think you are pursuing greatness, but you are really begging for permission. Jobs realized that if he wanted to create something truly extraordinary, he had to stop asking for permission altogether. He had to stop worrying about being understood, admired, or accepted. He had to stop living for applause and start living for truth. This shift was not easy. It was painful. To let go of approval is to walk through fire. It means accepting the loneliness that comes when the world no longer claps for you. It means embracing the silence when no one praises your work. It means choosing to stand by your vision, even when the crowd turns its back. But here's the paradox Steve uncovered. The moment you stop needing approval, the moment you stop begging for recognition, that is when the world finally pays attention. People didn't respect Jobs because he conformed. They respected him because he refused to. They didn't admire him because he sought their approval. They admired him because he no longer needed it. This is why Apple, under his return, became unstoppable. Not because the world suddenly believed in him, but because Steve Jobs no longer cared if they did. He understood that greatness is not built on the applause of others, but on the conviction within yourself. And that is the illusion of approval. It will seduce you. It will enslave you. It will whisper that you are nothing unless others validate you. But if you dare to strip it away, if you dare to create, to build, to live without needing anyone's recognition, that is when you step into real power. Steve Jobs discovered this truth in the ashes of his humiliation. He learned that applause is temporary, critics are temporary, and validation is temporary. But the person you become when you stop chasing it, that is permanent. That is unshakable. That is where freedom begins. Most people are terrified of being alone. Silence scares them. Solitude makes them anxious. They need noise, distraction, conversation, and constant stimulation to feel alive. But Steve Jobs discovered a darker, more powerful truth. Greatness is born in isolation. When he was cast out of Apple, the world thought he was finished. The newspapers mocked him. The business community whispered about his downfall. Friends disappeared, allies turned their backs, and the applause he once lived on vanished into silence. For most people, this would be the end. For Jobs, it became the beginning. In that silence, Jobs faced something he had avoided his entire life: himself. Without the noise of constant approval, or the chaos of running a company, he was forced to ask the questions no one wants to ask. Who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when the spotlight is gone? Who am I when there is no stage, no applause, no recognition? It was in isolation that Jobs the power of stripping life down to its rawest essence. No distractions, no noise. Just vision, thought, and brutal honesty. He began to see that when you are surrounded by people, you inherit their expectations. Their doubts become your doubts. Their fears become your limits. Their voices drown out your own. But when you isolate yourself, when you embrace the silence, you finally hear the one voice that matters, the voice inside. Jobs spent years in this space of quiet, building NXT, learning lessons through failure, nurturing Pixar, which at the time seemed like a risky gamble rather than a future empire. And during this period he transformed. He learned that isolation is not weakness. It is a weapon. It sharpens focus. It clarifies vision. It burns away what is unimportant until only the essential remains. Think about the world you live in now. You are bombarded every second with notifications, opinions, judgments, and comparisons. Your phone vibrates, your inbox fills, your feed never ends. The world doesn't want you to be alone. The world doesn't want you to think for yourself. It wants you to stay distracted, to stay dependent, to stay addicted to noise. Because noise keeps you from discovering your true power. But Jobs proved something different. By stepping into isolation, he reclaimed control over his own mind. He no longer reacted to the world. He began to design it. His ideas grew not from committee meetings or social approval, but from the silence of solitude. The iMac, the iPod, the iPhone. These weren't the products of groupthink. They were born in the mind of someone who dared to think alone. Isolation taught him discipline. It taught him patience. It taught him that most people fail not because they lack talent, but because they are afraid to stand alone long enough for their vision to take shape. They fold under pressure. They need validation too quickly. They can't withstand the loneliness required to bring something extraordinary into existence. Steve Jobs embraced that loneliness. He leaned into the discomfort, and in that space, he discovered a truth most people never face. You do not become powerful by surrounding yourself with people. You become powerful by confronting yourself in silence. But do not mistake this for arrogance or detachment. This was not isolation for the sake of ego. This was isolation for the sake of clarity. to filter out the world until only the essential remained, to strip away everything irrelevant until his purpose burned so brightly that nothing could extinguish it. That is the power of isolation. It is not glamorous. It is not comfortable. It is not filled with applause or recognition. It is dark, it is quiet, and it is lonely. But it is in that very loneliness that strength is forged. Jobs knew that the crowd would never build his vision for him. The crowd would only resist it. The world would not hand him answers. The world would only hand him distractions. So he stepped away. He walked into silence. And from that silence, he returned not as a man begging for approval, but as a force capable of reshaping industries. Isolation is where you separate who you truly are from who the world wants you to be. It is where you learn to think your own thoughts, to feel your own convictions, to trust your own instincts. And once you taste the clarity that comes from that silence, you will never again mistake noise for truth. That is why Steve Jobs never feared being misunderstood. That is why he never begged to be liked. He didn't need the crowd. He had already built himself in the shadows, in the quiet, in the relentless power of isolation. There is a side of success no one wants to talk about. The side that is cold, brutal, and merciless. The side where everything you built collapses and you are forced to face the ruins. This was Steve Jobs' reality when he was pushed out of Apple, the very company he had created. It was not just a professional defeat, it was a personal death. His identity was torn apart. His reputation was destroyed. His future is uncertain. And in that darkness, Steve Jobs discovered a truth that would change everything. Pain is not the end. Pain is the birthplace of reinvention. For most people, pain becomes a graveyard. They bury their dreams under the weight of rejection. They bury their potential under the sting of humiliation. They bury their identity under the fear of starting over. But Jobs chose a different path. Instead of letting pain bury him, he let it break him down, strip him bare, and force him to rebuild himself from the ground up. In those years away from Apple, Jobs confronted the raw reality of failure. The spotlight was gone, the applause was gone, the prestige was gone, and what remained was only the pain of starting over. Most people would run from that feeling, but Jobs leaned into it, understood that pain, when faced directly, is a teacher. It exposes what is weak. It highlights what is false. It burns away what is unnecessary. And when you allow it to do its work, you emerge not weaker but sharper. This is what happened with NXT. By all external measures, NXT was not a triumphant success. It struggled. It stumbled. It never reached the heights Apple would later achieve. But NXT was not meant to be Apple. NXT was the laboratory where Jobs experimented, where he learned, where he redefined himself. Every failure at NXT became a lesson in focus, in design, in discipline. And those lessons would later become the DNA of Apple's greatest triumphs. Then there was Pixar. What began as a risky acquisition, a studio with no real future, became a revolution in storytelling. Toy Story was not just a movie. It was proof that pain and failure can open doors to entirely new universes if you are willing to step through them. Pixar was not just about animation. It was about Jobs reinventing himself as more than a tech visionary. He became a storyteller, a dreamer, a creator of worlds. All of this was forged in pain. Without failure, there would be no NXT. Without NXT, there would be no foundation for Apple's rebirth. Without Pixar, there would be no proof that Jobs could transcend industries. The very setbacks that seemed to end him became the soil in which reinvention took root. But here's the part that most people miss. Reinvention is not glamorous. It is not romantic. It is not the highlight reel people later admire. Reinvention is brutal. It is sleepless nights filled with doubt. It is watching your ideas collapse over and over again. It is questioning your worth, questioning your identity, questioning if you even have what it takes anymore. And yet, it is in those nights that the old self dies and a new one begins to emerge. Jobs learned that you cannot cling to who you were when life tears you apart. You cannot hold on to the identity that failed. You cannot live in the shadow of what you used to be. To survive pain, you must let it burn the old version of you down. You must be willing to die to your past self, so you can rise as someone stronger, bolder, and more unshakable. When Jobs eventually returned to Apple, he was not the same man who had been exiled years earlier. He was leaner in vision, sharper in judgment, more ruthless in execution. The pain had stripped away the excess. The failures had forced him to simplify. The reinvention had carved him into someone who no longer needed approval, no longer needed validation, no longer needed the world's permission. He had rebuilt himself, not for them, but for himself. And because of that, when he returned, he didn't just lead Apple, he transformed it into the most valuable company in the world. Reinvention through pain is the path most will never walk because it demands too much. It demands that you let go of comfort. It demands that you allow your pride to shatter. It demands that you face humiliation without running. But if you endure it, if you embrace the pain and allow it to reshape you, what emerges is no longer the fragile self you once were. What emerges is a self forged in fire. Steve Jobs discovered that pain is not punishment, it is purification. It does not come to an end, but to refine you. It forces you to confront who you are, strip away what you are not, and rebuild what you must become. And it is in that cycle of breaking and rebuilding, of falling and rising, that true power is born. That is the lesson of reinvention through pain. It is not the easy road. It is not the road most people choose. But for Steve Jobs, it was the only road worth walking, because it was in that suffering that he discovered the strength not just to return, but to rise higher than ever before. Success, the word itself, is seductive. It promises recognition, admiration, wealth, and the illusion of power. People spend their entire lives chasing it, sacrificing their time, their energy, and sometimes even their souls for a taste of it. But Steve Jobs uncovered a truth that most will never understand. Success is not the goal. Success is the byproduct. The true goal is self-mastery. When Jobs was young, he was obsessed with achievement. He wanted to prove to the world that he was different, that he was smarter, that he was destined to lead. Every decision, every invention, every move was driven by the hunger to succeed. But what he found along the way was that no amount of external success could quiet the chaos within. Because success without mastery is empty. It is fragile. It can be taken away in a moment. Look at what happened when he was forced out of Apple. Overnight, all of his success evaporated. The empire he built, the reputation he had earned, the power he thought was permanent, it was gone. If his identity had been built solely on success, he would have been destroyed. But that collapse forced him to confront something deeper. It forced him to ask, who am I without Apple? Who am I without the stage, without the company, without the success? And the answer was clear. He was nothing unless he mastered himself first. Self-mastery is the ability to govern your own mind, your own emotions, your own impulses. It is the discipline to focus when the world distracts you. It is the strength to act on conviction when everyone else doubts you. It is the clarity to know what you stand for, even when standing for it makes you unpopular. Jobs learned that if you cannot master yourself, the world will master you. If you cannot control your own fears, you will live by the fears of others. If you cannot discipline your own mind, you will be enslaved by the noise of the crowd. Success may come, but it will not last, because without self-mastery, success is built on sand. This is why, when Jobs returned to Apple, he did not return as the same man. The young Jobs was brilliant but reckless, visionary but undisciplined, creative, but consumed by ego. The jobs that returned were sharper, leaner, and more focused. He had mastered the art of simplicity. He had mastered the discipline of saying no to 1,000 distractions so he could say yes to the one thing that mattered. He had mastered his own impulses, his own emotions, his own tendency to let chaos rule over clarity, and that mastery became the foundation for Apple's rebirth. The iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, these were not just products. They were the manifestation of a man who had learned to master himself first, before attempting to master the world. Think about it. The world is full of people chasing success, but how many of them can sit alone in silence and face their own mind without fear? How many of them can control their own emotions when everything around them collapses? How many of them can resist the temptation of distraction, comfort, and instant gratification to pursue something that takes years to build? That is why most people fail. Not because they lack talent, not because they lack opportunity, but because they lack mastery over themselves. Jobs realized that the greatest enemy is not competition. The greatest enemy is not critics. The greatest enemy is the undisciplined self. It is the self that wants shortcuts, the self that wants approval, the self that wants comfort. To build something extraordinary, that self must be conquered. And once you conquer yourself, the world becomes irrelevant. Critics lose their power. Doubters fade away. The noise disappears. Because nothing outside can shake what is unshakable inside. This is what Jobs meant when he spoke about living his own life, not someone else's. It was not just about following passion. It was about self-mastery. It was about becoming so grounded in his own vision, so disciplined in his own execution, so ruthless in his own focus, that no failure, no rejection, no humiliation could derail him again. Self-mastery is why he was able to walk back into Apple and rebuild it into the most valuable company in the world. Not because success mattered to him, but because it didn't. Success was no longer the goal. The goal was building something true, something essential, something that reflected the clarity he had forged within himself. And because he no longer needed success, success came in greater measure than he could have imagined. This is the paradox. The moment you stop chasing success and start mastering yourself, success begins to chase you. The moment you no longer need approval, the world starts to take notice. The moment you no longer depend on recognition, you become undeniable. Steve Jobs did not achieve greatness because he chased success harder than anyone else. He achieved greatness because he mastered himself so completely that the world had no choice but to follow. In the end, Steve Jobs' life was not just about building Apple or launching products that changed the world. It was about a man who learned, through pain and rejection, through isolation and failure, that true power does not come from the world outside. It comes from the world within. He discovered that approval is an illusion, that the crowd's applause is fleeting, and that greatness cannot be built on the fragile foundation of other people's opinions. He discovered that isolation is not emptiness, but strength, the silence in which vision is born. He discovered that pain is not a punishment, but a crucible, a fire that burns away the weak self, so a stronger one can rise. And he discovered that success is not the ultimate goal, but the inevitable result of mastering yourself so completely that the world has no choice but to bend. Steve Jobs changed himself, not for the critics, not for the applause, not even for Apple. He changed himself for himself. And because of that, he left behind more than a company, more than inventions, more than wealth. He left behind a lesson, a reminder that the greatest power you will ever possess is the ability to change who you are, not for them, but for you. That is where freedom begins. That is where greatness begins. That is where your revolution begins.